If you've been wanting or trying to use white gouache in your paintings and you're not sure how to do it, I think this video is going to help you because I'm going to be sharing my favorite and most effective gouache technique. You'll get to see why it's so great for watercolor painting and how exactly I use it. Hi, I'm Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. You might have noticed, but white gouache can be pretty tricky with watercolors because if you add too much of it, your art can go from loose and looking vibrant and fresh to looking all muddy, heavy, and overworked. That's why sometimes it's just better to preserve paper white highlights or use a supply-like masking fluid. It's what I do most of the times. But I'm making this video because I know that there are times where white gouache is just a better option. The white gouache technique that I'm talking about enhances a painting when it's used right. And I was inspired by this reference here for my demo. And with all this foam, this is a great example of something that I would prefer to recreate with white gouache because there are far too many details to preserve by avoiding paper white highlights or applying masking fluid. And of course, there's not a single way to approach a reference. There's not one single style either. But if you relate to my kind of style, if you want to use white gouache to create realism and make it look subtle, and keep that fresh and vibrant look that's characteristic of watercolors, then I think what's following is going to be helpful. The very first thing to keep in mind about white gouache is that it's going to show best on dark colors, but also vivid colors. That's why the first step here is to mix the watercolors so there is color on this paper, because that is what will make it possible to apply white gouache later on. I decided to use a limited palette as always, and I made sure to have each color mix feel like it's runny in consistency so the pigment can actually flow on a wet watercolor paper. But I also wanted to show, to build up that vibrancy. So it's important to have enough paint in there too, and that's why in the end my mixes tend to look creamy, kind of like milk. So in a watercolor painting, remember that first you'll want to forget about white gouache completely and just focus on building up your colors and vibrancy. We'll use white gouache at the very end, and I would do this for anything, any type of subject. Even with other mediums, it's common to add the bright highlights last. And for white gouache in particular, we wouldn't want other colors, especially shadow colors, to mix with it, as they would contaminate it very fast and they would also turn it into pastel colors and give the painting that chalky look I was talking about earlier. And that again is what makes a watercolor painting look overworked when you use white gouache. Before I keep going, I would love to know from you in the comments if you have used white gouache before and what struggles you face with it, so I know what kind of video I can make next. Now you can see I started applying the main colors, and for the white gouache to look great in the end, the focus now is to have these mix with each other in a way that looks natural, and that's why I overlap sea and sand together. It's especially important in a seascape like this one since there's foam in that area where the sea meets the beach, and for it to look believable, we'll need some sort of a gradient between the quinacridone gold color that I used for the sand and the turquoise green and blue colors in the sea. And if this painting feels a little bit technical, a little bit too advanced for you right now, I teach this in depth in my last masterclass with 10 different seascapes for late beginner and intermediate levels. I go over everything from color to the techniques and the ways to paint certain effects. And of course, I use gouache as well, but I also share all the techniques that I know to create highlights in a seascape painting. And the reason why I bring this up is because right now I'm running a summer celebration sale where you get 15% off my classes, including this one here. So if you want to learn to paint seascapes along with me, you can check out the link in the description of the video. While this is still wet, I like to suggest the rocks that are located underwater. And another big thing that you can do to make the white gouache edition even better later is to lift paint to depict the shallow area near the beach. The gouache wouldn't be very visible on light areas like these, but in this specific landscape, I like it because this is already some kind of a highlight in itself now the paint was lifted. It's just not going to be as bright as the gouache will be. But still, it's a nice way to suggest how the wave ends right there, and this makes the foam effect I'll paint later with the gouache look like a logical thing to see. It's similar to building a gradient of color between water and sand like I showed you before, except that here we're building a gradient of highlights and light tones. So remember that even though white gouache does work better on dark and vivid areas, sometimes, in some cases, it's a good thing to add it on those lighter areas to contribute to the realism in the painting. When the sheet is still wet, I add a few loose details like the various sand formations that I saw in the reference. And I recommend to do this if you have a good control of the water. Otherwise, you can always dry the sheet at any time, wet it again, and keep painting. Now this is dry, it's time to define the rocks that are sticking out of the water and add the necessary shadow to them. The rocks stand out in the water because they are so much darker and different in color. That's why I decided to use a dark sepia color mixed to my sand color, quinacridone gold. And I even added a little bit of blue to it to make it even darker and also keep that color harmony going. Now, to make the rocks look like they are part of the water and avoid making them look like they're floating on top, I soften edges with a clean and damp paintbrush. It's my favorite technique for realism. So much so that this is what I would tell you to use for white gouache if you ask me. The problem is that softening edges alone is not enough for white gouache, and you're going to see this since now it's time to add the gouache. Everything is dry, and that's important so that the gouache doesn't mix with the other colors and lead to that muddy mess we talked about before. And something really important, I'm going to insist on that, is to use the gouache as pure as possible, unless you want subtle highlights that barely show. To get the crisp highlights, the ones that we see on the reference, you should add just enough water to the gouache you get from a tube, so it's easy for you to deposit the paint on paper, because sometimes if the gouache is too pure, too thick, it's really complicated to paint. So in this case, what you can do is just wet a paintbrush, not too much, you don't want it to be dripping wet, just a little bit wet to go mix a little bit of the white gouache with it, and normally you should be good to go. As you can see, I add the gouache and I soften the edges, so the foam looks like it's melting into the water. So having this almost pure paint and softening edges on that will be the combo that creates the best and the most natural gouache highlights, with gradients from seeing the almost pure version of the gouache to a much softer, dreamy one. I do this for every painting I use white gouache in, and I'll only add a little bit more water to the gouache if I want a subtle highlight instead of a crisp one. Now notice how adding movement with these curvy brush strokes also helps the white gouache look like it's part of the painting, even though it stands out so much. This might be something to consider when you use white gouache in other paintings, to see how you can match your strokes to whatever type of highlight you're trying to capture. That will help the gouache look like it's part of your piece even more. In my reference, there were so many highlights and foamy effects to paint that it would have been a pain for me to try and mask them all. I also really don't like it when the white highlights look a bit fake, when the edges are so sharp they're impossible to conceal. And that's why I think the white gouache is better sometimes, depending on the result you're after and on your style, of course. But for realism, it works really well. On the sand, I make sure that the gouache is thick enough to render that foam meeting the beach effect. This technique works well in a seascape like this one, and it turns out pretty realistic every time I've done it on small and even large paintings. And I teach one of those seascapes, an easier one, in the masterclass I was mentioning before. So if you want to train on that, that is something you can consider doing. What I really love about white gouache is that it's also fun to use different watercolor techniques and apply them to the gouache. For example, here, I render highlights to depict the wet sand with the dry brush technique. It works really well, as you can see. And if you add too much gouache or you make a mistake, I didn't mention it before, but it would also be easier to remove than watercolor paint. And I think that's another bonus point for white gouache highlights. I think it's pretty low risk. A common thing with gouache, and you'll know right away if you added too much water or not, is to see it dry much lighter than you expected. So usually that's because there was too much water in it. Or it could also be the quality of your gouache that's not that great. In this case, what you can do is layer on top with more gouache. It's really just like watercolor. It's just easier to remove or fix, but otherwise the techniques are the same. I don't like the colors that I used for the sand and water here, to be honest. I think they're a little bit bright. But overall, I'm happy with how the seascape turned out. And it's funny because I had already painted that one long ago in a small format and I used gouache already. I hope you enjoyed this. Here's a video that you can watch next if you want to see my favorite watercolor techniques in action for seascapes in particular. And remember that the link to the Seascape Masterclass is in the description if you're watching this when the video comes out and you're able to grab the discount before June 26th. Thank you for watching and see you next time.